Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I wanted to formally conclude the Primarch project series by talking about the Lost Legions. I want to briefly talk about the Lost Legions and the ideas surrounding them, right? So in the creation of the Astartes Legions, the Emperor created 20 legions of Adeptus Astartes, but something would happen to the 2nd and 11th legions, which would see them erased from the history of the Imperium. This would leave a hole in the lore that is super mysterious, and because it's super mysterious, everyone has a theory about what happened to them, right? First, let's talk about the creator's perspective of the setting, right? Rick Priestley, one of the forefathers of the Warhammer 40k universe and its lore, is the individual who wrote about the two missing legions while writing the lore for the Horus Heresy. Basically, Rick Priestley wrote a brief passage about the Horus Heresy as a kind of origin story to the setting of the Warhammer 40k universe. He never intended for it to be its own setting in Games Workshop's IP. The two missing legions were written as an extra layer of mystery surrounding the already mysterious Horus Heresy era of Warhammer 40k history. There was apparently an interview where he dismisses the idea that the Lost Legions were made to allow players to make their own legions. The statement is appropriately corrected to be applied to Warhammer 40k because, as said before, there was very little thought actually put into the Lost Legions or to the heresy itself. Rick Priestley focused on Warhammer 40k, and during this time in the setting there were said to be 1,000 Space Marine chapters. He himself only created around 100, so the rest of the Space Marine chapters were basically slots for players and fans of the setting to create their own Space Marine chapters. But as far as the two missing legions were concerned, as well as the Horus Heresy itself, it was largely undefined, and he left that undefined for a reason. He didn't want it to be its own setting. He didn't intend for it to be its own setting. He just left it as a mysterious origin story. So there was no story for the two missing legions, and the Horus Heresy was only used as a way of explaining why the Warhammer 40k universe was the way it was, basically. Rick Priestley is literally the reason why homebrew chapters are a default part of the setting. With all due respect to the awesome contributions that Rick Priestley made to the Warhammer 40k universe to bring it to life, and while still acknowledging how important those contributions were, for the purpose of this video, we are going to respectfully ignore his perspective of the Horus Heresy and the missing legions. The reason why is because, like I said, he never intended or predicted for the Horus Heresy to be its own setting. It has become its own setting. The idea that he brought forth has become its own being and developed its own identity beyond what he wanted it to be. Therefore, his perspective on the topic of the Horus Heresy is now technically outdated. So I wanted to go over some of the literary references to the Lost Primarchs and their legions found throughout the Black Library novels and stories that are focused on the Horus Heresy. I wanted to do that, but then I ran into a problem, right? Before we get into that, let's add a bit of context to the subject from which we can determine everything else, right? Part of the Emperor's Great Crusade was recovering the scattered Primarchs. The approximate discovery of each is listed on Wikipedia, including the missing Primarchs. The order according to available information is as followed: Horus Lupercal, Leman Russ, Primarch Project Number 2, Ferris, Fulgrim, Vulcan, Dorn, Gilliman, Magnus, Sanguinius, the Lion, Perturabo, Mortarion, Logar, Jagatai, Conrad, Angron, Corvus, Primarch Project Number 11, and finally Alfarius. That is the order in which the Primarchs were found throughout the Great Crusade. Now we have to add a slight edit to the list because we know that Alfarius was actually the first Primarch and not the last, but Alfarius was the last Primarch to be publicly acknowledged as Omegon, right? So basically the list saying that Alfarius was the last Primarch is only true based on a technicality. But anyway, the two missing Primarchs are on the list, but something else to take into consideration is the fact that the Emperor created the 2nd and 11th legions on Terra and used them during the Great Crusade. There is mention of the 2nd and 11th Legions taking part in the Ragdan genocides, and that gives some clues as to what happened to them. Okay, so now we know the approximate order in which the missing Primarchs were found. We know that the Emperor created their legions and used them during the latter Unification Wars and early Great Crusade. Something else that could help us with a sense of narrative context and direction is the fact that we have some really big events that happened during the Great Crusade involving the legions, such as the Ulanor Crusade, the Ragdan genocides, etc. If we combine the order in which the Primarchs were found and correspond them to the dates of these pivotal moments in the Great Crusade, we can come up with more conclusions about the missing legions and their Primarchs. And this is before going into the narrative references made by the various authors of GW/Black Library. For example, the Great Crusade itself lasted approximately between 798 M30 all the way to 005 M31. By the time the Great Crusade ends, all the Primarchs were found, but not all of them participate in the Horus Heresy. The Ragdan genocides happened from approximately 839 M30 all the way to 890 M30, taking up a large portion of the Great Crusade. It is recorded in available records that the 2nd and 11th Legions fought in the Xenocides. It is also hinted that entire Space Marine legions were lost to the Imperium during this conflict. Now, for the literary references of the Lost Legions and their Primarchs. While making the Primarch Project videos, I didn't lean too heavily on any one author's portrayal of what happened in the books regarding the Horus Heresy. I generally picked which perspectives I would add based on the flow of the story that I was telling on the Primarch's upbringing. I generally approached the author's accounts of events as potentially true, so long as I can make it make sense in story form. The reason why I didn't lean too heavily on the author's account or one author's account or another author's account was that the authors were simply presenting accounts. They were presenting their own perspectives. And just because they are GW authors doesn't mean that the perspective that they are sharing is the truth, right? So the reason why I'm saying that is because the perspectives that the authors present on the Lost Legions and the Primarchs range from being openly contradictory to each other all the way to being very obviously meaningless. Most of them are scenes from various books saying, hey, I'm about to bring up the topic of our lost brothers, and some other character saying, brother, no, don't talk about them and the horrible fate that became of them, over and over and over and over again. There's a list of the references on Wikipedia. I could go through it myself, but it's a really long list of pointless references. The only real references of value come directly from another one of the forefathers of Warhammer 40k, Alan Bligh, who basically took the foundation that Rick Priestley made and fleshed out the Horus Heresy, making it the setting that we enjoy today. He wrote these compendiums of lore, commonly referred to as the Black Books. These are some of the best books in Warhammer 40k history. People who have these books hold on to them as valued treasures, and people who sell them for over $1,000 each. These are gems. Alan Bligh was a gem, and unfortunately he lost his fight to cancer and passed away. But that's also why these books are so valuable, because he wrote them. The person who basically made the Horus Heresy a real thing wrote these books. If you play Warhammer 30k, you have to know his name. You have to understand just how important this man was and still is. In the Black Books, Alan Bligh makes 3 references to the missing legions and their potential fates. Because Rick Priestley didn't put much thought behind the missing Primarchs and Alan Bligh did, whatever Alan Bligh says as the person who basically made the Horus Heresy its own setting is the truth of the matter, right? So, in Book 1 of the Horus Heresy Black Books, Bligh says that out of the 20 legions that were created, 18 would grow into vast forces by the end of the Great Crusade, meaning sometime during the Great Crusade, 2 of them would not, referring to the 2 missing legions. In Book 2 of the Horus Heresy Black Books, there is a chronicle of the final days of the Great Crusade, and there are 2 dates that have whatever happened on them listed as redacted: 965 M30 and 969 M30. This corresponds to when the Space Wolves get involved with the Ragdan Xenocides, the third wars of the Xenocides. This potentially suggests that some shady shit happened during those dates, and it potentially involved the Space Wolves. The last reference is from Book 7 of the Horus Heresy Black Books, and it talks a bit more about the Space Wolves' history and campaigns, and it mentions something called the Darkest War during the Ragdan Xenocides, during which it is said that entire legions were lost in the conflict. So there's a pattern here. Every time the 2 missing legions are mentioned, the Ragdan Xenocides are also mentioned. When the Ragdan Xenocides are mentioned, the 2 missing legions are not mentioned afterwards. So we can conclude that Alan Bligh intended to hint that these 2 legions were lost during the Ragdan Xenocides. But there are 2 questions that usually come up after this. 1, what happened to them? And 2, what happened to their Primarchs? Well, there was something wrong with both of the legions. They were significantly smaller in number to the other legions due theoretically to some sort of flaw. In Book 3 of the Horus Heresy Black Books, they talk about the Alpha Legion and the whole Alpha induction phase. According to this book, the Alpha induction phase failed on one of the legions, which is listed as redacted. In my Alfarius Omegon Primarch video, I theorized that the Alpha induction phase is hypno-indoctrination, basically psycho-conditioning or mind control to a degree. The Alpha Legion would pass these phases with flying colors. The other known legions would respond to the Alpha induction and use it to small degrees, but one of the proto-legions failed the Alpha induction phase due to issues with their gene seed. Despite this, the Emperor would continue to grow said legion and have it participate in the Great Crusade. Secondly, there was something about the conflict against the Ragdan that brought these flaws out of the legions. While it is heavily implied that these 2 legions were lost during the Xenocides, it does not say that they were wiped out by the Ragdan, but instead, the lore would imply that they had to be eliminated by the Emperor's forces. All this talk about the Ragdan. What were the Ragdan? They were a species of Xenos that existed to the north and east of the galaxy during the Great Crusade. They were technologically advanced, and they enslaved other species and used those species to fight their battles for them. Beyond that, we don't know much about them except that it took the Imperium 3 campaigns to actually get rid of these guys. The casualties to the Imperial side were astronomical, and during the last campaign, the Emperor basically had to take the gloves off and call in the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves. Now, to those who don't know anything about the Horus Heresy history of the legions, you hear that and you probably are like, why the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves? What's so special about them? Well, let me tell you. The Dark Angels were the first legion to ever be created. Their original name before they were reunited with Lionel Johnson was the Angels of Death. Do you know why they were called the Angels of Death? Because they had the privilege of using Dark Age of technology weapons. We're talking about weapons that reduced the thriving empire that existed before the Imperium into the Age of Strife. We're talking about war crime level weapons. When we think about Space Marine war crimes during the 30K era, most people think about the Death Guard because of them virus bombing everybody. And you know, virus bombing is horrible, but the Death Guard had nothing on the Dark Angels. The Dark Angels basically invented Exterminatus, where, you know, entire planets are destroyed. Atomic and nuclear weapons, men of iron, death rays, they had the weapons to do the job and the Emperor's permission to use them. When they were led by Lionel Johnson, the Legion used these weapons against the horrors of the galaxy, the many Xenos species that existed at the time. The Dark Angels became monster hunters and monster killers, so that's why they were sent to fight the Ragda. The Dark Angels made entire species go extinct, and that's what was necessary to defeat the Ragda. The Space Wolves have had the title of being the Emperor's executioners and have had it for some time. The Emperor used the Space Wolves to bring Imperial forces back into compliance with the program, you know? So Imperial forces that would try to do their own thing and ignore the Emperor's demands had the Space Wolves sent to them real quick. The first official deployment of the Space Wolves was on some world that suddenly decided that it didn't want to follow the program of the Imperium of Man. They wanted to do their own thing, right? So the Emperor sent the Space Wolves to deal with them, and he watched from orbit. Listen, the Space Wolves deployed their entire legion onto this world in less than an hour. And it wasn't even on the entire world. Instead, it was on one city. The entire Space Wolves Legion deployed onto one city in less than an hour. It was a bloodbath. Everybody was killed. It was a slaughter. Men were killed. Women were killed. Children were killed. People who were fighting back were killed. People who were running away were killed, especially people who were running away. Fun fact, don't run away from the Space Wolves. They like it. It physically makes them want to hunt you more. It's in their gene seed. When they ran out of bullets, the Space Wolves legitimately just started tearing people apart with their bare hands, and I'm not even joking. People who were hiding were literally hunted down through smell and ripped to shreds. It was crazy. Not a single person was left alive in this city. And when the rest of the world heard about what happened in that city, the entire world complied. They surrendered. They were like, we are so sorry, Emperor, please don't kill us. And it was such a slaughter that the Imperial authorities brought their concerns to the Emperor, like, bro, that was actually out of control. We should probably do something about the Legion. But the Emperor was like, nah, they're perfect. And ever since then, the Space Wolves have been sent to solve the Emperor's problems. We saw it multiple times during the Horus Heresy when the Space Wolves were sent to discipline the World Eaters, which resulted in the Night of the Wolf, where the two legions beat the crap out of each other. We also saw it during the burning of Prospero, when the Space Wolves slaughtered the Prosperans and razed Prospero to the ground. The Space Wolves were going crazy. Leman Russ literally picked up Magnus and broke his back across his knee, like unruly. But these are the two legions that the Emperor sent to put an end to the Ragdan genocides, and that they did. It is heavily suggested that the Space Wolves wiped out the two missing legions, because during the Horus Heresy, it's referred to many times that the Space Wolves have been sent to correct the error of other Space Marine legions, despite there being no record of this ever happening during the Great Crusade. Now, an explanation for why there is no record of this is twofold. The first is because the Dark Angels likely had something to do with it too. The Dark Angels collected information during the early Great Crusade, information that they kept secret. This information largely had to do with how to kill different species of aliens. The Dark Angels are the reason why there's so little information on the Ragda in the first place. They just have it secreted away. They could also have information on what happened to the 2nd and 11th Legion secreted away. But there is a more well-known reason why there is no record of the Space Wolves fighting other legions before the heresy, and it's because the Emperor decreed it to be so. The missing legions and their Primarchs were forbidden topics, and any evidence of their existence was wiped from the face of the lore. So that's that. The Space Wolves and the Dark Angels destroyed the 2nd and 11th Legions. And now that I think of it, you know what this reminds me of? The Emperor sending the Custodes to kill the Thunder Warriors because they were unstable creations that were a liability to the future of the Imperium that the Emperor had planned. Something went wrong with the 2nd and 11th Legions, and it costed them their existence. Now that we've talked about the legions, concerning the missing Primarchs, it's interesting, right? Because if we line up when the missing Primarchs were discovered by the Imperium, only one was around during the Ragdan genocides, or at least it was discovered during the conflict. The second Primarch was discovered around 821 M30, when the Xenocides were in full swing. I mentioned in the Alpharius video that there was an alternative story to the discovery of Omegon, which says that Omegon was found during the Ragdan Genocides. The story goes that Omegon landed on the thriving tech oligarchy world of Bar Savar, but In less than a decade after he landed on the world was attacked by an alien species called the Sloth, which decimated the population of the world and kidnapped the Primarch, him being the only being that was strong enough to endure their torture. They kept him as an experiment and warped his mind, turning him into a living weapon bent toward their cause. They would drop him on worlds to cause chaos and confusion ahead of the Sloth fleet, kind of like how Tyranids utilized the Genestealer cult ahead of their arrival. It was said that Omegon was rescued by the Emperor himself, who jammed his golden ship, the Bucephalus, into the stone ship of the Sloth. The Emperor would spend years trying to undo the psychological damage that the Sloth did to the Primarch. It is unknown if he was ever successful, but probably not. In my Alfarius video, I reject this interpretation of Omegon's origin story because it doesn't fit into the rest of the story seamlessly. If Omegon was mentally disturbed by the Sloth, then it would have affected Alfarius as well, being that they were connected. But rather than discredit the story entirely, I theorize that this is actually the story of one of the missing Primarchs. He was captured and tortured by an enslaving alien species and used as a weapon to herald their arrival, and the Emperor couldn't save them. That would make for a great story, right? As far as there being any quote-unquote official lore of the 11th Primarch, all we really know was that they were discovered after Corvus Corax in 927 M30, and that they were actually the last Primarch to be found before Omegon was found by Horus. I think narratively this gives reason for why the story of Omegon and one of the missing Primarchs is so consistently mixed up, since Omegon was a secret, unknown, lost Primarch for a time. But of the 11th Primarch, we know next to nothing. We know that their legion had already been wiped from existence by this time, and a Primarch without a legion is pretty much useless. Okay, so now that we went over that, let's talk a bit about the possibilities of what the missing legions could have been like. It's fun to think about because there is literally no lore about them whatsoever besides those small bits of information. If I were to theorize, which I am going to theorize, about the missing legions, being that one, as a proto-legion, failed the alpha induction phase, and we have already theorized that the alpha induction phase was basically psycho-conditioning, I'd say that at least one of the missing legions, most likely the second one, was a little too independent-minded and maybe just a tad bit uncooperative with the Emperor's demands. They also probably killed a lot of human beings during the Great Crusade too. The reason why I say this is because during the Horus Heresy, one of the reasons that some of the Primarchs just co-signed themselves to the side of the traitors is because they basically decimated their own homeworlds. When Proto-Rabbo finds out that his world has turned its back on the Imperium, he brings the Iron Warriors to Olympia and kills the majority of the world's population. When Proto-Rabbo realizes this, or he realizes what he's done, he is 100% convinced that the Emperor won't forgive him for it and joins the traitors rather than face his father. Conrad Kurz did the same thing. When Nostromo returns to being a cesspool of crime and corruption, Kurz returns to Nostromo with his legion, the Night Lords, and kills everybody in horrible ways. From there, Conrad just joins the traitors. Rabute Guilliman is appalled at the mindless slaughter that he witnesses the World Eaters committing during the Great Crusade under the leadership of Angron, and he reports this information to the Emperor. The Emperor actually sends the Space Wolves to force the World Eaters to chill out. That doesn't work. It was the Night of the Wolf. They beat the shit out of each other, and then Leman Russ basically walked away and told the Emperor, like, this is not going to work. The Emperor himself was going to leave the 9th Legion, later to be called the Revenant Legion, or the Blood Angels. The Emperor was going to leave the Blood Angels on the moons of Neptune to die because their cannibalistic practices had gone overboard. If not for finding Sanguinius, the Legion would have been destroyed and there wouldn't be any Blood Angels. Even under Sanguinius' leadership, after acknowledging the Red Thirst, Sanguinius keeps it a secret, hoping to escape the fate of the missing legions because they too had flaws in their gene seed. All of the Primarchs were worried about overkill toward humans during the Great Crusade in fear of the Emperor's wrath. So I think that that had to be at least one of the reasons why the 2nd Legion no longer exists. Another thing, their Primarch being used as a weapon of terror and destruction ahead of Xenos' fleets is actually pretty metal, but it also suggests that the Second Legion was used as a tool of chaos and destruction. And you know how, like, despite the fact that the legions and their Primarchs were separate for most of the Great Crusade, but still they somehow went through the same things? Perhaps the Second Legion and their Primarch shared the experience of being or feeling like slaves to someone else. For the Second Primarch, he was a slave to the Sloth alien species, and to the Second Legion, they felt like slaves to the Emperor, maybe. As something of a final point for the case of the Second Legion, the possibility of them being a truly rebellious legion to the point of it potentially being a gene seed flaw, which made it necessary for them to be wiped out, it makes me think of an old idea in Warhammer and Warhammer 40k lore, the lore of the fifth Chaos God, Malice. Referred to as the Renegade God, the Outcast God, and the Lost God, Malice was the Chaos God of anarchic destruction, whose agents fought against everyone, loyal or traitor, even against themselves. The idea of Malice existed in both Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k, kind of like Be'lakor. In Warhammer 40k, though, Malice is known as Malal. In one of the books in the Horus Heresy series, Horus Lupercal is having a conversation with Malcador the Sigillite. He is trying to be defiant against Malcador by trying to say the name of one of the missing Primarchs. When he tries to say the name, Malcador uses the Force, his psychic powers, to basically crush Horus's windpipe and choke him out, rather than allow him to say the name. Horus manages to squeeze out the following sound, Mal-Ow, before calling it quits. Now, there is the possibility that upon realizing that he was going to get choked the fuck out by Malcador, he tries to say Malcador's name in an attempt to be like, chill out bro, it was just a joke. There is, however, the possibility that he successfully said the missing Primarch's name, Malal. This is actually hotly debated by some people in the community. Some think that he was just trying to say Malcador's name. Their reasoning is that Horus wouldn't know the missing Primarch's name because the Emperor wiped it from their memory. But we now know that that isn't true. Multiple Primarchs hint at remembering their lost brothers. They just aren't allowed to talk about them. Also, Horus was the first Primarch to be found, and the second Primarch project was the third Primarch to be found. He definitely knew his brother, at least for some time. I think the author was trying to insinuate that one of the missing Primarchs was Malal, and this makes so much sense to the setting because the concept of Malal was removed from Games Workshop's intellectual property due to the person who wrote Malal into the lore leaving Games Workshop and taking the idea with them. The story behind it certainly matches with the lore or the in-lore narrative of him not being able to be talked about by anyone ever. Not to mention, there is a Space Marine chapter called the Sons of Malice, who are now excommunicated as traitors and who commit themselves to Malal as a chaos entity. Now, 2 points about this, right? The Sons of Malice had a different name at one point, but no one remembers what it was. As a loyalist chapter, they were one of 20 Space Marine chapters referred to collectively as the Astartes Praeses, whose job it was to guard the regions around the Eye of Terror. They practiced widespread cannibalism, and their gene seed information does not appear in any official records of the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is sus. Perhaps they could have been made using one of the missing Primarch's gene seed, especially since we know it still exists, but we'll get into that later. The second point I want to make is that Games Workshop has reclaimed the idea of a fifth Chaos God. Instead of it being called Malal or Malice, it is called the Dark King. The Dark King is actually the Emperor, who becomes this god near the end of the Siege of Terra, but is brought back from the brink. I say all this to say that chaos is definitely an aspect of the Emperor's soul, and as such, a Primarch could have embodied that aspect. Concerning the 11th Legion, I don't even know. I made a list of the Loyalist and Traitor Legions, and I made correspondences between the two lists. It seems that both Loyalists and Heretics have legions that specialize in the same kind of warfare, generally speaking. I soon realized that I would technically have to make 2 sets of lists because the legions differed slightly between when the Emperor used them and when they were reunited with their Primarchs. But basically, most of the legions had a corresponding legion to itself. For example, and like I know that some people who don't know Warhammer 30k lore are going to be like, what are you talking about? These legions are not really similar at all. And I could really just spend the rest of the video trying to explain these correspondences, but instead I'll say, if you know, you know. And if you don't know, please research it, all right? Anyway, for example, the Space Wolves and the World Eaters, these are correspondences. The Ultramarines and the Emperor's Children are correspondences. The Salamanders and the Death Guard are correspondences. The Iron Hands and the Iron Warriors, correspondences. The Imperial Fists and the Word Bearers, correspondences. The White Scars and the Sons of Horus, correspondences. The Raven Guard and the Alpha Legion, correspondences, and so on and so on and so on. There were 2 legions, however, that didn't have correspondences. One was the Blood Angels. There is no Chaos Legion that serves as a mirror to the style of war or the story of the 9th Legion. If the Sons of Malice are made from one of the missing Primarch's gene seed, and it's actually the source of their cannibalistic practices and not just the world they recruit from, then I humbly suggest that the 2nd Legion be listed as the Chaos correspondence to the 9th Legion, the Chaos correspondence to the Blood Angels. The other Legion that didn't have a correspondence was the Thousand Sons. Now, the thing is, the Thousand Sons became a Chaos Legion, so their correspondence would have to be a Loyalist Legion. What would the main characteristic of a Legion and Primarch that is the Loyalist version of the Thousand Sons be? Well, considering that the Thousand Sons were a legion of psychers, and it's one of the reasons they fell to chaos, perhaps it's possible that the Loyalist correspondence was a legion of blanks or psychic nulls. All of the Primarchs were invested with warp-based abilities, but what if one was a psychic null, or at least resistant to psychic powers, or at least had a pariah gene? I don't really know, y'all, but as a concluding thought to this topic, I want to say that because the Sang Primus Portum exists, Space Marine chapters can now be created from the lineage of the missing Primarchs. The Sang Primus Portum contains a genetic sample of each of the Primarchs. Belisarius Cawl used it to create the Primaris Marines. He pleaded with Guilliman for permission to use the missing legion's gene seed to create new chapters, but Guilliman firmly forbid him from doing so. But Guilliman was also in stasis forever, like basically, and the Primaris project was a secret, so who could have stopped Cawl from doing so anyway? Isn't it funny how an idea that originally wasn't supposed to have an answer can now have many answers? Ultimately, the missing Primarchs can be whatever you want them to be since they don't exist anymore, and it's possible to even field a chapter made from their gene seed in the current setting of Warhammer 40k. Even I've created a missing Primarch and Legion idea. Ultimately, you can do so as well. This formally concludes the Primarch Project series. Thank you all for watching. Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.